Hello and welcome once again to the Spouter-Inn. I'm Chris.
And I'm Suzanne.
And I've been rereading the Gospel according to Mark.
And I've been rereading John Milton's On the Morning of Christ's Nativity, sometimes called the Nativity Ode.
So, listeners, please get yourself a comfy drink, pull up a seat, and join us for a conversation about these books and more here at the Spouter-Inn. Ho-ri-o-ho, 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 ho. I feel like we'll talk about this in a little bit down the road, but I feel like since, it's sort of the holiday season when this episode is coming out and we're going to be talking about some Christian-themed books and poems and stuff about Jesus and all that we put our positions on the table at first, which is to say, I was raised in a Christian environment. I was raised Episcopalian and am not still a believer. So I'm coming at this from a very literary perspective. I'm not here to say anything about the religious aspect of it per se. That parts of that might come up, but that's sort of not my interest in these texts.
Yeah, I mean, if I could say a word about my own way of approaching the Gospels and also Christian scripture more generally, I was also raised in a religious environment as a Jehovah's Witness. And so there was a very, very big focus on Bible study. And maybe we'll talk about that a bit later. And I am not a Christian, I'm a Muslim, something that I became involved with as a young adult. And I really am grateful to have had that experience of a big focus on Bible study because it gave me a kind of knowledge base that I love going back to. But it creates this weird kind of tension between thinking about the Bible as literature and Bible as scripture. And so I find that always really interesting to think about. So that's one of the reasons I'm so looking forward to hearing what you have to say about your experience of reading Mark.
Fantastic. Well, before we get to that topic specifically, I want to say, as I've mentioned before, I often like to listen to an audiobook while reading the text to really focus me in, especially if I'm going to be talking about a book on this show. And while I've read the Gospel of Mark many times over the years, to revisit it this time, I thought it would be fun to have a nice audiobook version of it to listen to. And do you know who's done an audiobook of the entire Bible?
No.
David Suchet.
Really?
AKA the actor who played Hercule Poirot,
yeah.
who converted to Christianity at some point or became sort of very involved in it and aspired, I guess, for a long time to do an audiobook of the Bible and finally had an opportunity to do it. It was published in 2014.
My goodness.
It's a perfectly lovely reading of the New International Version of the Bible.
So the whole thing?
I believe he did the whole thing.
Goodness.
I admit I only listened to Mark, but I enjoyed it. It was a very good audiobook.
When you say it's a very good audiobook, what are some of the things you look for? Like, what are some of the things that make it good for you?
Well, that's kind of an interesting question. And I feel like my relationship to audiobooks is changing the more I listen to them. But I definitely am leaning more to the side of I don't want it to be too produced usually. Mm-hmm. I don't want too many special effects. I don't necessarily want a cast of readers. And especially for something like this, I want it to be relatively neutral and clear. I want to be able to follow and understand what's going on without an excessively emotive reader.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That makes sense.
Although sometimes that's appropriate. I don't know. Some like the Mysteries of Udolpho that I talked about, which was a fantastic audiobook experience for me, was a bit more over the top than I normally like.
Well, the book is more over the top, right?
Well, exactly. And it kind of worked in the end. Like I kind of really appreciated that. But, I definitely appreciated the sort of very pleasant, congenial affect that David Suchet brought to reading the Bible. Who knew?
No, it makes sense, right? Because when you're talking about scripture, right, I don't want to say it's overdetermined, but it's like very, very heavy with meaning, right? And because there's layers and layers of interpretation and different ways that devout communities have related to it, right? So having a reading that's like not flat, but like is not doing too much to push you one way or the other is probably really good.
Yeah, I suppose also my main experience with hearing these texts read aloud is in the context of a church service where they are delivered with a certain kind of
fanciness.
Well, fanciness, but also trying to compel you to get involved, get more excited. Like they're trying to inspire you with the spirit or at least the experiences that I've had have at least tried to do that a little bit. And this was a lot more calm. It was committed, it was confident, it was assured, but it wasn't trying to win me over to the text.
Mm-hmm.
Which I thought was great. I don't know. It was good. Do you listen to a lot of audiobooks? You don't mention them very often.
Not at all. Like occasionally I'll take a peek, but take a quick little listen to one just to get a little sense of a flavor of it if I have the opportunity. But because when I read, I might have said this in the past, I kind of hear what I'm reading. Like I don't know if it's quite synesthesia, but like that's the sensation I have. So I really like that. I really like that experience. So I kind of do it for myself in a sense. And especially if I'm reading poetry, I'll often if it's a section that I'm really interested in, I'll actually read it out loud for myself.
Oh yeah, you have to often.
Yeah, so like what is a long way of saying the oral quality of the text. I really, really, really appreciate that, but I tend to like to do it for myself rather than let somebody else do it for me.
Yeah, no, fair enough. It's how you can come to understand a text better, and sometimes you don't want somebody else's interpretation influencing you too much, I suppose. I don't know.
Yeah. Though if I was, like, for example, if I was a driver or if I was really better about exercise or something, in other words, if I was doing things where having audio would be really lovely, I feel like audiobooks would be a great place to do it. Speaking of audiobooks, when we had the chance to talk together with John Nicholas recently about his parents' book, Cry of the Ancients, one of the things we talked about is his desire to make that book more accessible to listeners as well as to readers. And we talked a little bit about different ways of doing that. And I just wanted to kind of report that he's now working with another friend of ours, who's a very experienced video and audio editor, to do that, to do a reading of some of the chapters with his commentary. And I was just really excited to see the ways in which the conversation we had has kind of laid the foundations for, if not exactly an audio book, an audio life, I guess you could say, ongoing life of John Nicholas's parents' book. So that's good news.
Yeah, that's very exciting. You'll have to let us know when that project is available.
Yeah.
Which might take a while, I understand.
Yeah, but when it is, I'm definitely going to report on it.
The men seized Jesus and arrested him. Then one of those standing near drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. "Am I leading a rebellion," said Jesus, "that you have come out with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I was with you, teaching in the temple courts, and you did not arrest me. But the scriptures must be fulfilled." Then everyone deserted him and fled. A young man, wearing nothing but a linen garment, was following Jesus. When they seized him, he fled naked, leaving his garment behind. So for those of you who don't know, the New Testament, the Christian New Testament of the Bible, begins with 4 accounts of Jesus' life and teachings. The Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the Gospels according to these 4 people. Matthew, Mark, and Luke kind of tell a very similar story, whereas John is noticeably different from the other ones. And of the 3 that are telling a similar story that sort of tell the same stories in more or less the same order, more or less, Luke is generally considered the more polished and literary one. It's the one that Linus quotes from in the Charlie Brown Christmas special. Matthew is the gospel that Goldilocks read, I guess, because Mark is kind of the weird outlier. I mean, John is also a weird outlier, but Mark is weird in a different way, I suppose.
I'm so struck by you saying this because I always think of Mark as being like the simplest one, like the most focused one, because Luke will give us all the childhood narrative, which makes it, of course, very appropriate for Peanuts, right? It'll give us the whole, sometimes called the infancy gospel narrative, right? And John is way out there doing something totally different. Matthew gives us a kind of an expansive account. He gives us the greatest number of parables. But Marcus, I always think of the one as the most kind of pared down. But you feel like it's weird. I want to hear why you feel that way.
Yes. Well, I'll be happy to talk about that some more. Mark is my favorite of them, I suppose, although John also has its appeal. I don't know if you have a favorite gospel. That might be a weird thing for somebody who's not a believer, or it might be more of a normal thing for somebody who's not a believer to say.
No, it's totally normal. I mean, I think, again, because of that childhood experience of Bible study and spending a lot of time reading, my favorites are definitely John and Luke.
Okay.
Because I like like you said, the literariness, like the thickness of the story in Luke. It's really wonderful. And John is very mystical. gospel.
Yes.
Like it starts with that whole, like, in the beginning was the Word thing, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And it's like, you read that and you're like, wait, what?
Yeah, no, it's a lot more philosophical, a lot more mystical, a lot more hard to wrap your head around at times, I guess, in a way that's quite interesting and compelling.
Super interesting.
I find Mark to be the strangest. You're right that it's the most pared down. It's also generally thought to be the earliest of them to be written, somewhere around the year 70. And, the authorship, who actually wrote it, is debated, but whatever. That doesn't matter for us, I suppose. And I guess people tend to think that Matthew and Luke are drawing upon Mark and expanding it, maybe incorporating some other sources. That's all well and good. I find Mark to be the weirdest one because it doesn't follow what I expect from the Jesus life narrative, because I guess the Luke story is so much more familiar to me. So, like, as you say, it doesn't include anything about his birth, which, I mean, given that, I grew up at a time when Christmas was the most important holiday, it's kind of not. I understand that, but like Easter is. But Christmas feels like the most important holiday to a casual, I suppose. And so, like, the fact that it's not there, that it starts instead with, it starts with a little bit of setup of like quotes from Isaiah, some prophecies that Jesus is coming, so to speak, and then he goes to John the Baptist to get baptized. Like we find him as a full adult showing up strangely and making waves. I was going to say that feels like a weird pun, but I didn't mean it that way. Either way, like it starts off very strangely, and he's already like gathering followers by the end of the first chapter, which, again, for those of you unfamiliar, typically the Bible's books are broken up into chapters and then verses within them. Those chapters seem sometimes very arbitrarily applied.
Yeah. They seem sometimes very like kind of concatenated. Yeah. No, I agree. One of the things that really strikes me about the beginning of Mark, though, and I wonder if it strikes you too, is like you said, it's very bare bones. We get right into the adulthood ministry of Jesus, but we get also a bit about John the Baptist. Like, we don't get a huge amount of a John the Baptist narrative. That happens later. It gets sort of tucked into a chapter as like backstory, but it's kind of the introduction or like the way in to Jesus' ministry. And I always think that's so interesting. Like, why is it that that's, for Mark, clearly a really important framing device?
Yeah, to my sense, we're setting up a few prophecies, and then the prophecy will be fulfilled. And those prophecies are coming from Isaiah, and they're coming from John the Baptist, and then they will be fulfilled. And we're going to see that flourishing, that fulfillment become more revealed over the course of the text. So that's my sense of what that's doing there. Although, like, I don't think a writer today would get to Jesus that quickly if that was what they were trying to do. It feels, you said compressed, and it is a very short text, and it does move very quickly between one thing and the next part of that thing, let's say, which I find gives it a certain energy, but also the pacing can sometimes feel a bit odd.
Yeah. Well, it's sometimes it feels like the gospel is the story of the life of a person. So the life of Jesus. And you really get that feeling with Luke, right? Because you got that whole like early, the birth, early life and so on. Whereas in Mark, we start with baptism, like Jesus being baptized by John the Baptist. Like, it's the story of the ministry as opposed to the story of the man, almost, like I always think, which I think is very interesting.
Yeah. The bulk of what comes next is tales of him performing miraculous things, tales of him sort of telling stories, telling parables that explain things, and doing this thing, which is a lot of fun, I suppose, where he goes up to some sort of expert, some sort of teacher, somebody who knows the Jewish law and knows this, that, and the other thing. And it's just like, you're getting it all wrong. Here's the thing. And he makes a very elegant, direct, and authoritative proof. And it's like, zing, you got him. like that. There are all these little stories which end with these kind of punchline feels slightly sacrilegious, but that's sort of how it functions. It's like, no. Here's what's actually going on. Here's the zinger. And you're like, oh yeah, I get it now.
Can you give an example of that? I totally agree with you, but is there anyone that sticks out in your mind a lot?
So there's one moment when he's arguing with the Pharisees, one of various Jewish groups that have their own beliefs, and they're arguing about food and like the rituals around which foods are clean, which ones are not clean, which ones you're supposed to eat, which ones you're not supposed to eat. And the Pharisees say to Jesus, why don't your disciples live according to the tradition of the elders instead of eating their food with defiled hands? And he replied, Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you hypocrites. So, strong start. And then he goes on for a while insulting them, I suppose. And then he turns to the crowd and says, listen to me, everyone, and understand this. Nothing outside a person can defile them by going into them. Rather, it is what comes out of a person that defiles them. So it's this moment of like taking this idea of being unclean because of the food that you're consuming and just twisting its logic and showing a much more relatable or perhaps intuitive sense of what that could mean. Like I guess it's hard to say because, of course, I grew up in a very post-Jesus world, but like what Jesus is saying in that moment makes more sense on a more fundamental level than the law tradition is providing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That happens over and over again. There's a couple of moments maybe that are of that sort too that I really like in chapter 10, where, for example, there's that moment when children are brought up to Jesus, right? And the disciples rebuke those people who brought them. And then Jesus says this really famous line, suffer the little children to come unto me and forbid them not, for of such is the kingdom of God. Right. And then he puts his hands on them. Right. So it's like there's this, like not a zinger exactly, but it's like, no, this. Right. And similar, and just a little bit later on in the same chapter, there's this moment where a man comes and asks, what are the things I need to do to have eternal life? And Jesus like reminds him about the commandments. And the man says, yeah, I've done these since I was a youth. And then Jesus, beholding him, loved him and said unto him, one thing thou lackest, go thy way, sell whatsoever thou hast and give to the poor, and thou shalt have treasure in heaven. And come, take up the cross and follow me. And so it's this moment of like loving offer, right? And the man is sad and went away grieved, for he had great possessions.
Yeah.
Right. And then Jesus is like, how hardly shall they that have riches enter into the kingdom of God?
Yeah.
Right. So it's again, it's a zinger, but it's also like such an interesting kind of almost like transaction. Like it looks like things are really going along well. And Jesus in this loving way makes the offer and the guy doesn't take it. So there's like these incredibly interesting, like I said, kind of transactions that happen.
Sure. But they are so deftly laid out and then punctuated so well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And, many of the most famous lines from this book or, from the various gospels, because these stories repeat in the other gospels usually, are like the tagline, are the punchline to the anecdote. And it's such an interesting structure. It's so condensed here in particular in Mark, I suppose, because the language isn't quite as florid as it might be in Luke. But it functions the same in all of them. Mm-hmm. That is the kind of unit of textual composition that we're working with here, right? It's this anecdote that ends punchily.
Yeah, it's a good way to put it, because I often think about the little narratives of miracles or other kinds of exchanges with people that happen as one category, and then the parables as this other thing, because they're kind of like allegorical or figurative. But they're all, like you said, having this very similar kind of function, right? These like I don't know if anecdote is the right word, but they're like very specific, tiny little stories that have this function in the larger work, that do something to you.
Yeah. I mean, anecdote, that's interesting. I also tend to think of this as like, if you're having a conversation with friends and you're telling them a story, mm-hmm. this is a good length of a story bit. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And then you can let someone else tell their story. It's like a bunch of people standing around remembering this guy and all the great things that he said. And then they're all swapping these anecdotes back and forth, or however you want to put it. I also this comes up in the very first chapter. Where it's written, I feel like I'm getting into preacher language, where it says, the people were amazed at his teaching because he taught them as one who had authority, not as the teachers of the law. So I'm interested in how there is a kind of presence or charisma behind his speaking that allows him to be this direct, like that kind of directness, that kind of overthrowing of what's going on is part of what made him compelling for a lot of people, even outside of his ability to, cure people's illnesses and do other of that kind of obvious beneficial miracle that the book talks about him doing.
You put your finger on something really interesting there. Like authority is one way to put it, because people are kind of perceiving that sort of authority in him, but also power, right? The power to, like you said, cure illnesses, even bring back the dead, very cast unclean spirits out of people, right? There are these expressions of power, right? Which authority is kind of part of that. And one of the things that's so striking about it is that this power is kind of so loaded, right? It has so much behind it that it has to be handled very discreetly. Like there are a number of moments where a miracle takes place and then Jesus is like, do not tell anybody about this. Or he goes in to look after someone who ultimately will have to be, a young girl to be raised from the dead. You only take a couple of the disciples in with him.
Yes.
So there's this, so it's this like, I don't know what to call it, this like sort of substrate of power that's always running through it. And sometimes it's visible and sometimes it's sort of half hidden.
Yes. And that's one of the other things that I particularly love about Mark is that it really emphasizes this aspect of it, this kind of secrecy, this paranoia, it feels like in the early chapters of the book, where Jesus is constantly telling people, don't tell anyone about this. Which, again, if you're coming from an understanding of these as evangelical texts, as texts that are written to celebrate and convert or keep you converted in a sense, that it's unusual to encounter, don't spread the word. Don't tell anyone about this.
Well, the very word gospel, right? Like the good news, right? You're supposed to be out there, getting it out there in the world, right?
Exactly. And the book eventually does sort of get to that, but it spends quite a lot of time being like, don't tell anyone. It's a secret to everyone, which the book also doesn't explain directly why it's doing that. You can come up with all sorts of answers to that question that make sense. It's not an impossible interpretive task. But as somebody who's reading it sort of for a literary purpose rather than a theological purpose, I suppose, I'm not trying to necessarily solve the text. I'm not necessarily trying to come up with that answer. It's not so much that I'm happy to let the mystery be, but like I'm savoring the taste of that tension in the text. That's one of the things that is pulling me to this gospel in particular, is how strong that, what is going on here? Why is he so weird? Why is he so secretive? Why is he so interested in this insider-outsider divide?
Well, there's this one moment that I feel like kind of gets at this inside-outside and why it's so important in the context of the parable. I'm thinking of chapter 4, where you have the parable of the sower. So the person who spreads out the seeds that can grow. It's extremely beautiful, I think, part of the Gospel of Mark. And so he tells this parable, and then he says, unto you it's given to know the mystery of the kingdom of God. But unto them that are without, all these things are done in parables, that seeing they may see and not perceive, and hearing they may hear and not understand, lest at any time they should be converted and their sins should be forgiven them. And like, that's so mind blowing. Like, I'm telling you, right? But I'm going to do it in a way that some people will not understand, and they won't hear. And this question of why some are inside or some are outside seems very enigmatic in that moment.
Yes. So how do you read that? Like, what does that make you feel about the way that parables are functioning?
Well, I always think two things about this. One is, I think, well, this is very much in keeping with sort of allegorical ways or figurative ways of thinking about language, right? Those who have ears to hear, they will hear. Those who have understanding, they'll get it, right? So that's a sort of inside-outside that has to do with the nature of the person who's doing the interpretation, right? So it kind of makes sense there. But the way, that very bald way that's stated, right? Unto you it's given to know, but those ones, they will not be able to understand lest they should convert and be forgiven. I'm like, is our goal here not to convert and forgive people? Right? Like, I always find that very bewildering. Like, where, I guess because it exposes, where is the line of inside and outside? And I think for the Gospel of Mark, right, the inside-outside line is very much about the Jewish people and those who are outside. Whereas when you get into the works of Paul and so on, it's much more about the mission to the Gentiles, right? So the people who are outside. And the reason I say that is because elsewhere in Mark, there's that episode of a woman who's described as Syrophoenician, and she, seeks out a miracle from him. And he's like, is it right that the children should not eat so that I can feed the dogs? And she says, yes, Lord, but the little dogs do eat of the crumbs that fall from the table. And he says, your faith has made you clean.
Yeah. Game recognizes game.
Well, it's really interesting because it shows that there's this line and yet there's a porousness to it. And I think that's so fascinating.
Absolutely. The other thing that I think about is, you mentioned that bit about otherwise they might be forgiven, which is him quoting Isaiah again, right? He's quoting scripture, he's quoting a prophet. But again, in Mark, there's a lot more of that unforgiving version of Jesus, a lot more of that sort of raise up your swords kind of stuff. He is a more difficult person, I think, in Mark than in the other three Gospels. And maybe it's just that, I'm a filthy heathen and I'm here looking for novelty, but that's such a different take on this character that we've seen in the other books that I savor those moments as being like, ooh, I'm feeling something interesting in some other point of this character that I get to wrestle with.
Is there a moment that really stands out to you in that respect?
Yeah, one of the most sort of, there are a lot of odd moments in Mark, including the bit about the follower running away and losing his robe in the bit that I read at the beginning, which is not in the other Gospels, and we're not sure what's going on there, and in a really interesting, compelling way, I suppose. But Jesus gets really angry at a fig tree at one point, right before they enter Jerusalem. Seeing in the distance a fig tree in leaf, he went to find out if it had any fruit. When he reached it, he found nothing but leaves, because it was not the season for figs. And then he said to the tree, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." And then cut to a little bit later, when they're coming out of the city in the morning, so the next day, as they went along, they saw the fig tree withered from the roots.
This seems mean.
It's so arbitrary and mean. And why is he doing this? And again, you can answer that. There are certainly traditions of people answering that question, but the text doesn't really answer it in a way that makes any sense to me. Doesn't do it directly, let's just say. It's just this really striking, curious moment that sits uncomfortably in a very evocative way.
Yeah, it requires allegoresis, doesn't it? It requires you to develop some kind of interpretive apparatus that makes it work in the system. Or to just say, wow, that's a rough edge.
Yeah.
One or the other.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, again, there's a kind of reading that you can do if you're not trying to solve the text, to insist that it's, that it comes together, that it just becomes like that weird moment in a David Lynch film where you're like, well, I don't know what that was about, but I'm never forgetting that scene. And it feels somehow resonant, but maybe, and you could sit down and you could explain it, or you don't have to. You can just sort of, I don't know, savor it like a gap in your teeth. I don't know. I don't know. I that's one of the things I just like about this gospel, is that there's so many weird edges.
I just had to point out how incredibly mean this is, because, it's not like the fig tree is purposely being an annoying fig tree and not making fruit.
It's doing its job.
To be clear, when he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for the time of figs was not yet. Man, the tree is
he's depriving other people of figs.
It's not like it's a time of year and this fig tree is just being, obstreperous and not making figs at the correct time.
Yeah. No.
It's unreasonable.
It's completely unreasonable. But sometimes he's not reasonable. Sometimes he's not kind. Sometimes he's mean to a fig tree.
Well, you remember how you mentioned that there's the whole situation where there's no figs and then the next day they come by and the fig tree is all dried up. The thing that happens in between is also a Jesus rage moment.
Yes.
It's trashing the tables of the money changers in the temple.
Okay, but we can all agree that he's right.
About that, yes. No, I mean, that's what I mean, though. It's interesting that it's also an anger moment, but it's an anger moment we totally understand.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And then the fig tree anger moment, we're like, what?
Right. So I mean, that is an interesting structure, right? Where you've got, this baffling anger moment that has in the center of the sandwich a completely reasonable, we're on his side. Why are you trying to profit off religion or in the place of religion? That seems wrong. And yet is the idea that, if you accept the one, you have to accept the other? Maybe. But it's a very concise sense of the two sides of Jesus's anger.
Yeah, and it's a really interesting moment.
And of course, the other fascinating moment is the ending of the book. Now, you were raised in a particular tradition, and you were doing Bible study and all that. Did they talk about the extra ending to Mark?
I don't remember that being a topic of conversation. Actually, it became aware of that and like read a bit about it the first time I had the chance to teach Bible as literature, which is when I was in grad school at Columbia in the literature humanities class. And it was kind of presented as a textual problem. But in the like faith tradition, I don't remember this being a topic of conversation.
I don't remember whether I knew it either, even though I don't think it would have been as contentious an issue in the faith tradition that I grew up in.
Mm-hmm.
But for those who don't know, all signs point to the book of Mark originally ending with the women going to the tomb in which Jesus' body has been laid, finding that the giant stone, which was very heavy, has been rolled away. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. "Do not be alarmed," he said. "You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him? But go, tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. The end.
Mm.
And then there are traditions of a very short extension and then a much longer extension, which is usually printed in Bibles, sometimes in brackets or italics or whatever these days. But like that ending of the women running out and being afraid and not telling anyone about what they saw because they're afraid is such a striking ending to the book.
Yeah, I mean, if you read the King James, which is what I've got here, the Authorized King James, it shows you nothing of that. It just keeps going right into the rest of it. You know, Jesus appeared to Mary Magdalene, discussion with the apostles, Jesus appearing to his apostles again, and then he's received up to heaven, sits at the right hand of God. Then they went and preached. Amen. Like it gives you a real, how can I put it? It completely hides that, which is interesting in itself.
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure when they decided that that actually is a later addition. I wouldn't be surprised if they hadn't figured that out when the King James Version was made, although I know that there's been revisions over the years to that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that strange ending. The first time I read that, not knowing it was coming, not knowing that that was actually how the book ended, it was just like, what does it mean to end there?
I have to say from a literary point of view, that's a much better ending.
Of course, like nothing's terribly wrong with the way that it ends with the extension. It's fine. But like, that's such a striking one. And it gets back to that issue of, do we tell people? Do we not tell people?
Mm-hmm.
How does that function in the text? This text is very concerned with
inside, outside.
Yeah. And again, like he's said some things about how you should go tell people, you light a lamp so that the light will shine and everybody can see. Like there's all sorts of stuff about, yes, tell people, but there's also a lot of stuff about don't tell people. And it's such a like memorable note to end on.
Yeah, it's haunting, right?
Of just fear and panic and confusion and what next?
What next?
Oh,
I think that's exactly right.
So those are some of the reasons why Mark is my favorite gospel, though, I can totally understand if other people have a different one. And I want to say, I turned to rereading the Gospel of Mark. Yeah, holidays. I mean, this is the wrong one to pick if you want to talk about Christmassy stuff. Absolutely. Which, I enjoy about it, I guess. But also because I wanted to finally get around to reading two other recent retellings of Jesus' life that have been on my to-read pile for a while. The first of which I'm going to talk about is a novel by Jeff Ryman called Him that came out in 2023. I've talked about Jeff Ryman recently. He's a Canadian novelist who mostly has lived in England, and he wrote Was, the book about Dorothy Gale from The Wizard of Oz.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, really interesting book from the 90s, very intense, very striking. And he's gone on to write other interesting, striking works, including like a very notable hypertext, early sort of literary hypertext piece. We'll put some links in the show notes for that. This is, well, how shall I put this? We don't often talk on this show about books that we feel ambivalent about. Mm-hmm. And I want to give it a try because this is a book that I have very mixed feelings about, which does not mean it's a bad book or anything. Just that I'm walking away thinking,
Were there things you liked about it and things you liked less?
Exactly. Mm-hmm. And things that I'm still thinking about, which is a good thing. Mm-hmm. So this is a novel. This is very much a novel. Novel is a very expansive term that can mean all sorts of things. It's very capacious. This is a novel that looks and reads like a novel. And I guess one of the ways that I'm thinking about that, one of the ways I was thinking about this when comparing it to Mark, the Gospel of Mark, is thinking about how novels are really interested in the transitions between moments on a granular level that like Mark just isn't interested in.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And this may sound obvious, but like as an example, just imagine a couple, they're at a party, they have an argument, they're mad at each other, they leave the party, they go home, hash it out there. In a novel, you expect sort of the drive home, all the simmering tension to build up. You kind of like, that's the juicy goodness. That's what the Mysteries of Udolpho is all about, like savoring the drive home and milking that. Not all novels have to do that, but like that's a very novelistic thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if it were a gospel episode, I suppose, we would just jump cut to back at home, they said this, and we'd get the punchy one-liner.
Yeah.
Okay, so it was interesting to sort of turn to a novelistic exploration of some of the material of the life of Jesus. And I will say that there are lots of novelistic treatments of the life of Jesus in various ways. And I certainly didn't try to read all of them or even look at all of them. Here are some of the things that are particularly interesting about this one. First off, it kind of defamiliarizes the story for most readers, but certainly not all of them, by using the Aramaic names for everything. And of course, Aramaic is the language that Jesus would have spoken in his everyday life. So instead of Mary, the mother of Jesus, we have Mariam.
Mm-hmm.
And Mariam is going to be our point of view character for almost all the book. And so we get the familiar story. Mariam is told by an angel that she's going to have a virgin birth, and she does so. But the baby doesn't have any father. So, well, the book doesn't use this language directly, but we can understand that the baby, having no father, therefore has all the genetic information of the mother.
Mm-hmm.
And so Miriam welcomes a baby girl into the world, names her after her mother, Abigail, and is very excited about the baby. It's a gift from God. It's surely bound for glory. It's a reflection of her. It's got a chance to do all the things that Miriam was never able or allowed to do. And I mean, it's preternaturally talented, even as a baby, because of course it is. It's part God. So like it's a grown up in a baby shell, kind of. Like almost immediately it is a weird baby, but weird in the sense that it is just very, I don't know, intense and aware.
Mm-hmm.
Miriam has very high expectations for her daughter. But then, as a 5-year-old, the child announces to Miriam that he's actually a boy and he wants to be called Yahushua, and Miriam does not take this very well. And so we're exploring this life of the Jesus figure, that the Jesus in the book is going to take on many different names over the course of his life, from Abigail to Yeshua to son of Adam to yada, yada, yada. Like it just goes on, constantly changing names, which is an interesting tactic. And we'll eventually more or less follow the Jesus story, begin preaching. But this is about sort of Miriam's family life. The first half of the book is her having more and more children and having more and more difficulty with her eldest child, not really accepting what it's doing, thinking that it's kind of a perversion of the great godly plans that she has. The devil maybe got into the child, something like that. And then the second half is her sort of joining up with, I'm just going to say Jesus to keep it simple, joining up with Jesus on his teachings and travels and following him around and being sort of part of the entourage, let's say, until, of course, the end.
I'm absolutely fascinated when you describe the ways in which gender is working in this novel, because there's, as a medievalist, I'm like super excited because one of the ways they talk about the physiological makeup of Jesus is very much in terms of like, what are the consequences of him having, as we would say, like her genetic makeup, right? So there's elaborate discussions about, how he would have appeared, what his humoral makeup would have been, and so on, and accounting for him being male rather than female. So it's really interesting seeing what happens when you sort of play that out in the 21st century as opposed to when you play that out in another place and time. Like even Dante talks about this, like near the end of the Paradiso, there's this moment where Bernard of Clairvaux says to Dante, the traveler, he sort of encourages him to contemplate the appearance of Mary because it's that which is going to make him most prepared to see the image of the face of her son. So this idea that, that they're basically, like, if not identical, they're really lined up.
Yeah. And I should make it clear, the book is telling this through its understanding of first century logic, right? That, genes does not occur in the book.
Hmm.
It's much more using the same kind of logic that these medieval or earlier thinkers would have used to try to understand that, try to understand how that could have happened and what might have gone into her having a boy, like why it's weird that she had a boy.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
So that's an interesting idea. There's several interesting ideas in the book.
Mm-hmm.
It's particularly focused on Mariam and her difficulties with embracing the queerness. That word doesn't show up, but like it very much is alluded to,
Mm-hmm.
the queerness of her child. And she does eventually get won over. Like her life is weird. She's a virgin. She's had a bunch of kids. She and Yosef have never had sex. They just hand over some of his seeds so she can take care of that manually. Yeah. And so she's like, our life is not fitting the norm. Our life is weird. And I like our life. And like, there's a very embracing of that aspect of it. And sort of reflects that side of the Jesus story, that it's a bunch of, I don't know, misfits getting together and changing the world in this exciting way.
Yeah, I mean, that seems very faithful to a lot of elements, right?
Exactly. It definitely underlines some of those aspects of the original story and some of the other retellings of that story.
It strikes me as really interesting that contemporary retellings and rethinkings of gospel narrative like work to rethink gender, and particularly maybe even think about trans identities, like to that's a really important way of thinking through spirituality for the present moment. And the reason I'm wondering about that is, did you see Conclave when it came out last year?
No, I didn't. Is that part of that?
Well, sort of. I don't want to like spoiler, but
Right.
There's and this is not obviously about Jesus specifically, but it's about the spiritual direction of the selection of the next pope, and it opens up these issues in a really interesting way. And so that happens in the movie, but then that's taken from the book, which came out I think in 2016. This idea that gender identity is a really important site on which spirituality is understood.
Yeah.
And so I'm just really interested that's a thing that's happening now. That I don't know if it has. I mean, I don't mean to be like oversimplifying, but like, is it because people are really eager to try to rethink spirituality in a way that reckons with, I don't know, the problems of patriarchy? I don't want to oversimplify, but do you know what I mean? That there's a need to think this through, a real urgency in thinking this through for today.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And it sort of leads to some of the things that I wasn't as happy with the book about. Because that question of like transness and how it applies to Jesus and God, the book doesn't really do much with it. It's really interested in how Mariam, how the mother, has to deal with the transness of her son. And it feels like, to a certain extent, the transness is just one of many things that make the child exceptional and distant, even though there was an expectation of them being similar, right? Like it's, I don't know, I guess there's a trope of the mother or the parent, I suppose, who has very specific dreams and aspirations for their kid, and then the disappointment and then navigating that. Like that is one of the things that's going on. But like in terms of like, how does transness and God play out? Like it just doesn't feel like it's that engaged with it. And from the little that I was able to tell from there haven't been a lot of interviews with the author about the text that I was able to find. And the author is not trans, which isn't necessarily a problem, but like...
but limits how they could talk about
possibly.
that.
Yeah. I mean, I think the seed of the book was, what if Jesus had been born a woman? And then trans came after. And I don't know. I mean, I will also say, we're getting more into spoiler territory, I suppose, but like the climax of the book includes checking Jesus's genitals. It's just like, ooh, I don't know. That doesn't feel like the right note to land on there. Although, the Jesus penis is important, right? Like Leo Steinberg told us, So I don't know. I feel like I would have wanted... It's made me hungrier to read a trans author's take on this, somebody who's more invested in this sort of thing, and what a trans author might get out of this story and retelling it and thinking through this and playing with it more. There are lots of interesting things going on in the book. I don't think it's a bad book. I don't even think it's like doing bad by trans people, though it's not for me to say that, I suppose. In particular, like the writing around the passages where Jesus performs a miracle and like the world lurches in that moment are just incredibly well written. And the whole sequence where Lazarus gets resurrected and like it turns out no one involved really wanted that to happen. Can you imagine? Like you're in heaven basically, and like you're wrenched back a few days later, and you smell of death, and you come
you're
out
icky by then.
and your family is like, oh no,
Interesting.
And even Jesus is like, this shouldn't have happened. Like this isn't how it's supposed to be. And there's some really great passages in the book.
It's interesting how it exposes how incredibly important thinking about gender and sexuality with regard to Jesus' body, like how important that is now, but also how important that's been for readers and devout people, like always. Like when you mentioned Leo Steinberg, the art historian writing about Jesus' body, and there's a very long tradition of kind of unpacking what did people think about that, right? Like how do you understand someone who's both God and man, who's like both inhabits a sort of spiritual position that has to be understood in certain terms theologically, but also is fully enfleshed, right? And the enfleshment is really important. And as we get shown throughout the Gospels in all kinds of ways, like in the cases where we hear about Jesus reappearing after the crucifixion and, the whole doubting Thomas episode where, blessed are they that have not seen and have believed, right? But if you need to touch and see, for yourself to believe, well, that's fine too, right? So this idea of embodiment of Jesus is super important throughout, from the very beginning. And in the Middle Ages, like, there's these depictions of Christ crucified where the wound in his side is very explicitly depicted in terms that invite us to understand the wound being the womb, out of which humanity is reborn through the crucifixion. So like this, I don't know, I guess you want to call it like queerness, if we want to call it that, is like baked into the pie from the get-go.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And then just writers are unpacking it in all these different ways, right?
Yeah. I mean, writers, but also theologians. And yeah, exactly. Which I guess brings us to the other book that I wanted to bring up. And, there's going to be some obvious bias in discussion of this because it is friend of the show, Anthony Oliveira, who had a novel come out called Dayspring. It came out last year, 2024. And it's another gay Canadian writing about Jesus. And again, I'm biased. Anthony's an old grad school friend of mine. But oh boy, he knocked it out of the ballpark with this one.
Oh, that's awesome. I only read an excerpt. I've been looking forward to reading the book, and I have it, but my bookshelves are a mess, so I can't find it. But the parts I read were like very beautiful. Yes.
So here's the basic idea. All right. So in the Gospel according to John, there's a person who's referred to 6 times as, quote, the disciple whom Jesus loved. So in Oliveira's novel, our narrator is the disciple whom Jesus loved. And more specifically, he's in an emotional and sexual relationship with Jesus, happening both in biblical times, but also as an awkward teenager growing up in modern-day Toronto. It's both. And the people in biblical times will often talk like people in modern times, and sometimes the people in modern times will talk like biblical people or, higher fluting forms of the language and so forth, King Jamesian language perhaps. Mm-hmm. This is not a novelistic novel in the way that Ryman's is. Him is a novel. It looks like a novel. It reads like a novel. It is very recognizably a novel. Dayspring is written mostly with line breaks, often, but not always, in a very poetic register. There are also, generally speaking, not a lot of capital letters in this book, even though things are in sentences and there are periods. There's just everything is lowercase except for a very few moments here and there. There's a lot of white space on the pages. And following a certain publication tradition, delightfully, everything that Jesus says is printed in red ink.
I love that.
It's so good. It's such a good choice.
The rubrication. It's so good.
It's, again, not really doing a novel in the sense it's much more like Mark or like the other Gospels. It's interested in chunks of a story, an anecdote, a teaching, a scene, that chapters, so to speak, might last a few lines or a few pages, Each chapter is separated by a page break, which creates a kind of unit. And sometimes you get a few units in a row that like continue the story or continue the theme. But sometimes you're cutting away to, from modern to biblical times, or you're cutting to a quotation from one of the many writers on Christian themes, let's say. Teresa of Avila, Julian of Norwich, George Herbert, all sorts of different people are brought into the book as people whose texts echo the thoughts that are unfolding in the novel, which are echoing the events that are in Jesus' life, or events, I assume, it certainly seems like, in the author's life. It's all just webbed together in the most delightful way. I mean, I'm not a Christian, as we've already announced.
Mm-hmm.
This book feels like it is both describing some of the worst and most toxic aspects of Christianity and of the Jesus character, right? Like the outbursts of anger. Jesus is depicted here as a very charismatic, very irresistible, very troubling, very difficult guy to have in your life because he's just so different. His mind is so elsewhere. You cannot live up to his expectations, and yet you do, and yet you don't. Oh, it's just like, it's that one guy, So
there's this very beautiful passage in the excerpt that I did read, and I wonder if this captures some of what you're talking about, this transcendently beautiful and evocative quality, and this also like vernacular, kind of abrupt, even funniness. So I'm going to read a few lines. I remember the day he came to my brother and me on the shore as we knelt untying my father's skiff. Rosy-fingered dawn was unstitching night's design, and then there he was, in the flesh. Come with me, he said, reaching out a hand that in the years, short years to come, I would kiss until I knew its every callus and curve. Until the Romans broke it, as they break everything, and left it a mangled pulp for us to scrape from their torture post. Until the angels made it incorruptible and a beneficent sign for all to see. Until both left it perfect and golden and alien and unrecognizable to me. How can you follow anything, he said, if you are down upon your knees? Get up and walk, we have work down the road. What could I do but follow straight? We never saw the boat again. One time he got really fucking furious at a fig tree. Just absolutely screamed at it for like 45 minutes.
Yep.
It's like, it's this incredible juxtaposition, right? And it's a bit of an emotional roller coaster, even just from the part I was able to read.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Oh gosh, I was gonna just have you like pick a page number at random and read from it, because basically every page is delightful like that. Here's another retelling of a bit that you mentioned earlier. Once while visiting Tyre in the north, a Gentile woman who really didn't know much about your deal asked you to cure her daughter. And you said, I must tend to the children before the dogs, parentheses, which was rude. But she said, well, even dogs get leftovers. And so you healed the girl because you had to admit that was a pretty good comeback. So the other aspect of this, in addition to sort of presenting this like terrible side of Christianity, the narrator's parents in contemporary Toronto both sort of have a tremendous amount of difficulties with his homosexuality because, strict Catholic upbringing and all that. And Jesus is sometimes just a really you just can't. How can you be in a relationship with this person, with this God, with this, all this? But also he's sort of explaining why you would, like what the compelling thing is, like why there is this like unexplainable mark of beauty to all of it. I don't know, maybe it's just me. There is something so clear-eyed in how it's both compelling and repelling at the same time that really works a lot for me. And I feel like the story and the thoughts that he's having and the vulnerability of the text and the literary quality of the text, these are all just amazing and well thought out and well tied together. And, you love to see it when somebody, just nails it. And like this book shouldn't, it's not a normal novel. It's such a weird book. It's not quite like an open-ended poem. It's not quite scripture. It's not quite a theological treatise. It's not quite pornography. But it's a little of all of those things, and it just works. It's so good. I don't know. I'm very happy.
I'm excited to read more of it, and I'm interested too to get a sense of how people are responding to it. Like, I'm really happy to hear your thoughts, and I just wonder because it's pretty powerful, right?
Yeah.
And like you said, it's working in a whole range of modes, right? So
from what I've seen, like it sold reasonably well, I guess. And also I saw a lot of comments and feedback online after it had come out from people who come from a similar situation, especially queer people who grew up in Christianity, in Catholicism, and had a lot of the same thoughts. And it just was a beautiful summation of some of the things that they were also thinking, or showed them other ways of thinking about the experiences that they'd gone through. I think it is an interesting thing for anybody who has been, let's say, touched by Christianity to grapple with, to think with. It points to new ways into this tradition, into this text, or clarifies connections that are not always clear. And it's just a beautiful book. The writing is gorgeous, and it's a lovely book object. And
oh, awesome. Okay, I can't wait to read it. I'm going to search really hard. I'm going to find it.
Or buy a second copy. What's the problem if you have two?
That's true. Ring out, ye crystal spheres. Once bless our human ears, if ye have power to touch our senses so. And let your silver chime move in melodious time. And let the bass of heaven's deep organ blow. And with your ninefold harmony, make up full consort to the angelic symphony. For if such holy song enwrap our fancy long, time will run back and fetch the age of gold. I chose John Milton's On the Morning of Christ's Nativity, which is also sometimes called the Nativity Ode, because I thought I'd make a really interesting counterpart to talking about the Gospel of Mark, because Milton is so interested in the Bible, but also in retelling the Bible or regenerating it or refracting it. I don't know what term is right, but rendering it in English poetic form. And he does this all the time. And as I was reading and, sort of preparing for getting together today, I was thinking a lot about my experience, my experience of reading the Bible, Milton's experience of reading the Bible, my experience of reading Milton and Milton's reading, thinking about all of these as they're kind of interrelated. So I hope that might be interesting to think about together. Should I say a little bit about Milton, do you think?
Yeah, we have talked about Paradise Lost before, but that was a while ago, and people may not have heard that episode. So, yeah.
It was totally a while ago. I actually went and looked at it. It was in the spring of 2019, so it was a while.
And guess who we had as a guest for the bonus episode after that?
I remember it was Anthony Oliveira, right?
There we go.
Yeah. Well, so there are no coincidences. Things come right around. So John Milton was born in 1608, died in 1674, and lived in this period of tremendous sort of political and social change, which is interesting in itself. A few details about his personal life. His father was a composer and also a scrivener. And I mention this because you see lots of places that show Milton's interest in and knowledge of music, including the Nativity Ode. So maybe we'll say a word about that a little later on. He was educated at St. Paul's School and at Christ Church, Cambridge. And basically, when he finished college, he just hung out reading. Luckily, his father bankrolled him for some period of time just to do that. Right? So it was just kind of doing his thing, and traveled a bit in France and Italy before becoming a schoolmaster. And he does that for a while. And in the course of the revolutionary politics of his day, he goes on to become the Latin secretary to the government. And that may sound really obscure and tedious, but actually it was a really important diplomatic role, because that's the person who's kind of composing, putting together the missives that are traveling internationally. So it's a sort of a diplomatic functioning in habits. And however, he stops holding that role in 1652 because at that time he loses his sight. And his blindness is obviously it was a huge impact on him as a human being, but also it gets, again, refracted in his writing in this really interesting way, which you can see to some extent in his most famous work, Paradise Lost, but also in his last major work, Samson Agonistes, which is exactly about a blind, incredibly destructive, yet guided by God figure, right? So it's very sort of self-referential. He's married 3 times. I feel really bad for his wives because while he's a wonderful poet, he seems like an awful, awful human being to have to deal with. I will not say anything more about that, but great poet, would not want to live with him. And other than his major poetry, he writes a lot of prose, which is incredibly powerful. I don't know if you've had the chance to read some of Milton's prose. His most famous prose work is Areopagitica. It's this treatise about the liberty of unlicensed printing. He's an incredible prose writer, like really powerful, and the precision of language that he brings to the poetry, he brings to the prose as well. So it's like magnificent. And like I said, his major works are published like toward the end of his life: Paradise Lost in 1667, and then Samson Agonistes a bit later. And like I said, I really I have a lot of feelings about Milton because I first read his poetry as an undergraduate. And the very first thing we read in the Milton class was the Nativity Ode. So it was kind of my gateway, into reading Milton. And as I said, I think the poetry is incredible. I think his mind is incredible. And I really love his work. And yet he just seems like such an awful person, everything you know about his biography. So it's kind of strange because when you read an author a lot, it's obviously you don't know them, right? But you feel almost like as if you knew them. And so it's strange to have that kind of ambivalence. Well, I'm sort of segueing into talking about my experience of Milton. So as I said, I read him first in college and then had the opportunity to teach Paradise Lost, but not the Nativity Ode, in survey classes like major British writers. And then also I did teach a one semester class just on Milton, which was really a great experience. I love doing it. So I've kind of gotten well acquainted with him, and it was really neat to go back to this poem, which, as I said, I read for the first time many, 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 many years ago. But it's such a beautiful illustration of how it all works, like the system. He was, as I mentioned earlier, deeply committed not just to Bible reading, but to Bible study. And for him, writing poetry is very much about this transformation of biblical text into English poetry. And you see it in major works like Paradise Lost, right? But you also see it in short things. The Nativity Ode is a good example. Early on, he also publishes pieces that are absolutely clearly doing this. He has one that's a paraphrase on Psalm 114. And another one that's Psalm 136. So he's just how can I not just translate, because a lot of people are doing that in that period, but really render the nature of Scripture, and especially the weird time schemes of Scripture, in poetic form in English. So he's doing something very, unique, I think. Had you ever seen the Nativity Ode before?
No, this one had escaped my notice. I never studied Milton in particular in school, and while we read Paradise Lost, I never did. I've never done a deep dive on him. Mm-hmm. So this is new to me. So it's sort of celebrating Christ's birth and sort of painting the picture, but I guess it's really interested in how all those older gods are done with.
Yeah, there's this really interesting and kind of tumultuous passage where all the old gods get freaked out and have to run away, right? But before we get to that moment, I just want to say a little bit about the way the poem kind of sets us up for this. It's only a couple hundred lines long, right? A few hundred lines long. And it starts out setting us at a particular place and a particular time, right? So at the very beginning, it starts out this way. This is the month and this the happy morn wherein the Son of Heaven's eternal King, of wedded maid and virgin mother born, our great redemption from above did bring. For so the holy sages once did sing, that he our deadly forfeit should release, and with his Father work us a perpetual peace. So you get the sense that this is a particular place and time, this month, this morning, right now. And that clarity is actually surprisingly ambiguous once you sort of poke at it a little bit. Is he talking about the particular morning in the particular year when Jesus was born? Or is he talking about the annual cycle? Is it that time of year, right? Christmas, right? Is it that time of year of the Nativity? So are we in linear time, right? Like the moment when Jesus was born, or are we in cyclical time when that moment becomes present to us in spiritual terms? And that ambiguity is, and in particular, that relationship between the singular moment and the cycle moment runs all the way through the whole poem, which is, I think, really cool. And so he starts out with 4 opening stanzas that are kind of an invitation to the heavenly muse to offer a present to Jesus in the form of a hymn, and then as a kind of add-on to the gifts of the Magi. And then what we get is the hymn, which is the present itself, starting at stanza 5, which is kind of the story of the Nativity. So you get various personifications also are standing around waiting for something to happen. There's nature, there's peace, and everything is kind of still. The birds of calm sit brooding, the stars with deep amaze stand fixed in steadfast gaze, and the shepherds sat simply chatting in a rustic row, like everybody's holding still. And then stuff happens. The star shows up and the celestial spheres ring out with their ninefold harmony, right? So there's this change, but it's being registered at this almost supernatural level, right? When the globe of circular light appears in the sky and the 9 celestial spheres, right, make music. So music comes, but music comes not in the form of something that people do, right? But rather the music of the heavens, that is the form for all music in creation. So it's this really, like I said, music shows up in here in this very odd kind of way as like the structure of the universe.
It also feels like during this section of the poem that the language gets, I don't want to quite necessarily say simpler, but maybe more limpid, maybe more light and translucent than the sort of more momentous first few stanzas and what's going to be coming later.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. There's a kind of a lightness and a clarity to what comes. And that passage that, like when we get to the music of the spheres, that's when that passage shows up that I chose for the cold open. And it has us, has time kind of change its nature, right? He says, if such holy song enwrap our fancy long, time will run back and fetch the age of gold. So the idea being that time will run backward.
Right.
And then in the next stanza, he kind of tells you what could happen when time will run forward, right? He says, hell itself will pass away. Heaven will open wide the gates, right? So like time gets really, I don't know what to call it, unmoored from the ticking, the clock-like ticking of linear time, right? We go, backward to the age of gold and then forward to hell itself passing away. And then it stops and says, but wisest fate says no, this must not yet be so. The babe lies yet in smiling infancy, right? So there's this kind of holding off. So anyway, I don't know if it's hard with poetry, right? Like when we have poetic form that is so carefully crafted to put us in an odd spot with regard to the things that we believed we had a firm grip on, like the nature of time, like, it seems like 1 minute comes after the next, right? But poetic form has this ability to kind of put that into question for us and make it unstable, I think, in a way that is very difficult to talk about, but is incredibly powerful when you do it. And I think that's one of the reasons why Milton's so interested in bringing biblical text over into poetic form. I don't know if that's like an interesting or a helpful thing to share, but I find it absolutely absorbing.
Yeah. So at this point, at least in the poem, we're sort of, we've been through a few different slightly confusing temporalities, as you described.
Backward and forward, and then into this present moment.
Yeah. And now we've got this moment where, the babe lies yet in smiling infancy, that on the bitter cross must redeem our loss. So, like, you're looking at this moment where you're seeing the infant Jesus, but you're also recognizing in him this future event, which is also going to have a temporal effect that's going to resonate as we get, the wakeful trump of doom must thunder through the deep with such a horrid clang as on Mount Sinai rang. There's going to be, this everything will shake on Judgment Day. These are all seen in this moment, which is not this moment, but this is the moment that this is an anniversary of. It rhymes with this moment, right? And these are all connected together. So it gets very densely entangled.
Yeah, it's so weird, right? It's as if they're all like almost like superimposed on each other, as if in one of those moments you also see all these other moments. So it's an effect you could do like visually, you could do it with film, you could do it with other kinds of media where you like layered images one on top of another. But to do it in language, which unfolds in a linear way, is like, I don't know, it has this really disorienting kind of effect. You see it echoed even in the very last lines of the poem when, again, we're still in this infancy scene, right? The birth of Jesus. And it goes this way. But see the virgin blessed hath laid her babe to rest. Time is our tedious song should here have ending. And so something really weird is going on there. There are two things. One is the virgin has laid her babe to rest. Well, so she's put the baby down to sleep, right? On that day of the Nativity. But also like the babe is also put to rest in the sense that like the womb and the tomb are being kind of lined up here, right? So because the moment of birth is always already also the moment of the crucifixion, right? So there's this like doubleness that even haunts the last lines. And I love that one line, time is our tedious song should here have ending. Because here tedious is meaning like taking up time, right?
Right.
So what is song for relative to time, right? Song is the thing that measures out time, right? Like when you think about like how, you know more about this than I do, right? Like how music kind of structures time and its relationship to time, right?
Sure.
And yet it's also, right, it comes round. Like if you look at each one of these verses, and an ode is always, right, a musical form, right? Each one of these verses is kind of coming around to the same starting point. So like the tedious song is both linear, but it's also always curling back on itself, so that this moment is always the prefiguration or the fulfillment of some other moment. And they're all layered one on top of another over and over again. I think it's insane. I just love it.
Yeah, that is a very interesting through line throughout the poem.
Mm-hmm.
I have to admit, like that wasn't a thing that I was clocking as I was reading it, but I was reading it fairly quickly and casually. And you've spent a lot more time thinking about this than I have.
But, and also reading it out loud, right? I mean, that's a big part of it, and that was a big part of it. The very first time, like I said, I was introduced to this poem as like a tiny little undergraduate, right? That reading it out loud and really noticing how the sentences kind of go in different directions. Like with this one line, time is our tedious song. If we just stop after song, time is our tedious song, right? It invites you to think about what does that mean? And then if you carry the line forward, time is our tedious song should here have ending. You have to go back and change what you thought the opening of that sentence was saying, so that it doesn't mean time is this, our tedious song, but rather it is time for our tedious song to end. You know what I mean?
Yes.
So like there's this kind of, by taking apart the sentence in a linear way, it exposes the different directions that sentence could go in. And I know it sounds like really like mundane and like kind of like a really micro way of reading the poem, but it opens up the capacity of poetic language to express things that you can't express any other way. And I guess that's one of the reasons like I said, I really love Milton, even though he sounds like an awful person, because I don't know anybody who could do that with the same incredible precision. And like I said, when you read it out loud, especially this really haunting kind of quality, there's some incredible lines in this poem.
Yeah. The thing that I always remember enjoying about Milton in Paradise Lost certainly was his love of consonants, if that makes sense. And we get a bit of that just earlier in the passages about how all the old gods are going to flee, where he really savors the consonant clusters in the names of these other gods like Moloch and whatnot, but also adds more dense consonant clusters. In particular, there's a bit about and mooned Ashtaroth, heaven's queen and mother both, which is like, Heaven's Queen? Like there's apostrophes in the heavens, so it's like VNSQ all together. Wow, followed by mother oath. It's like you can do that, but it's just, that's a chunky thing. Better get that out of here. I mean, I don't know. I'm a little worried that it falls a bit into these are funny sounding words that we're going to get rid of, which it might. But nevertheless, he also is going to have fun playing with them while he's talking about it and contrasting them to the very sort of limpid bits in the Nativity itself scene of the stars and these more wide open sounds.
Exactly. I was just going to say that. I think that's exactly what's going on there. The nature of language there is reflecting the meaning in a way that is meant to be absolutely like contrary or in opposition to that limpidity that you were describing earlier. And in these stanzas that talk about the gods, one of the things that's really striking is you have that kind of, I don't want to say clunky, but that kind of abrasive and unexpected language that's happening in the description of Ashtaroth and Hammon and so on and Moloch. And it does this really odd thing once the poem gets to the to Osiris and the Egyptian gods, and it gives you a little bit of that like consonantal quality you were referring to before. Nor is Osiris seen in Memphian grove or green, trampling the unshowered grass with lowings loud. Nor can he be at rest within his sacred chest, naught but profoundest hell can be his shroud. In vain with timbreled anthems dark, the sable stolid sorcerers bear his worshipped ark. So it's like this weird thing happening with the language there. Like we've got the sable-stoled sorcerers, and they're bearing an ark that's worshipped. And it's a very odd moment, right? Because it invites you to think about the Ark of the Covenant and, the history of the Jewish people and the ways in which the Ark of the Covenant and the tablets of the law will be a prefiguration of the incarnation and all that, right? But this is a bad kind of perverted mirror image of this almost. And that's why there's a worshipped ark. But it's, carried by the sable-stoled sorcerers.
Yeah. And even on the page, like it's worshipped with an apostrophe D, right? And while the previous rhyme was anthems dark, and they bear his worshipped ark, but because of the apostrophe, it can look like worship dark.
Yes.
Which,
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That's exactly what's going on. There's a number of just like incredible lines in here. I have to share one very beautiful one that I think you might also like. This is from stanza 12, so around line 116 or so. And again, it's about music. And this is the heavenly music that attends the birth of Jesus, the celestial spheres. Such music as 'tis said before was never made, but when of old the sons of morning sung, while the Creator great his constellations set, and the well-balanced world on hinges hung. Is that a great line? The well-balanced world on hinges hung. It's like hanging a door, right?
yeah,
But it's like, and so it's this like oddly elevated and yet concrete language that he uses to talk about the time of creation, right? That's when the sons of morning, right? The angels, including Lucifer, right? We're singing.
Hinges hung. That's fun. Hinges and hung etymologically are related, but they're so far moved apart that they don't strike you immediately as being obviously related.
Like they kind of line up in this odd kind of way, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's like the dark, right? Except in an elevated kind of way, right? Where these two words have deviated and they come back together in the moment of creation when the hinges are hung, right? It's so cool. And so I think Milton is doing something really, really interesting with the Bible. It's kind of neat to take that back to our conversation before about the Gospel of Mark, right? Because he knows he's a huge reader. He's an obsessive, huge reader, right? He knows that text backward and forward, and he's like incredibly knowledgeable in Latin and Greek and Hebrew as well as other languages. Like, he's incredibly, I don't know, a very, very strong mind, right? And so he's rendering this text he knows so well as narrative poetry, and even in this case, lyric poetry in the Nativity Ode. And so I find it really interesting to think about, like, what is that? Like I was saying, there's all these different words for it, like regenerate. You could call it translation, but it's so much more like regeneration, retelling, recreating. I wonder if it makes sense to think about it in terms of storying, which is something we've talked about before. Like it's a kind of interpretation, right? But it's an interpretation that also unpacks and opens up all kinds of possibility in the text and is suitable for its place and time and the people who are reading it. I wonder, what do you think about that?
I think that's a very interesting connection to make. I don't feel qualified to say one way or the other whether that is accurate, but I think there's something to it. I'd be curious to hear more.
Yeah, well, but reflecting on this today, I remember Lee Maracle talking about storying like many different times. But one of the times she was talking about, it was in the context of talking about how writers would sometimes appropriate indigenous narrative and how that shouldn't happen. And she laughed and said, "Don't you people have any of your own stories?" Right. And then from that, we started talking about good examples of storying up that existed in like the Western tradition. And I remember her saying the Bible is this huge source of stories, right? And she mentioned The Handmaid's Tale as being a really interesting storying up of that. Right. And so it makes me, and then we talked about other books too, but it makes me think about, can we understand Milton as doing something like that, right? I mean, in the way that she was talking about it, not in the way that indigenous writers do storying and story it up, right? But in that way that she was talking about. I don't know, I find that really interesting to think with, especially think about like, what's a relationship of interpretation and commentary on the one hand to the original text, but also to, poetic forms and like what's generated, what's new. And in some ways that takes us back to something like what Anthony Oliveira is doing there, right? Like what is the relationship of the scripture that's behind it to the text he's created? Like it's not an adaptation, right? It's something else.
Yeah. I mean, I think that idea that, this whole tradition has been through, so to speak, has been through Milton, has been through Anthony, and they have managed to find an appropriate form
Mm-hmm.
and language to write down how the story has passed through them,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
how the tradition has passed through them.
And in a very layered way, like you were talking before about how in Dayspring, how there's all these other textual traditions that are reflected and refracted throughout it, right? You mentioned Herbert and others. In that passage I read, the rosy-fingered dawn passage, right? That comes from an English translation of Homer, right? So there's so many different layers of literature that are traveling through these traditions and coming out in the form of this new piece of writing.
Well, that was a fun conversation. We got to talk about a bunch of stuff.
We covered a lot of ground, but you know what? We did it to ourselves. You know, if you're going to like use a book of the Bible and a piece of work by Milton, you're going to talk for a while.
Yeah. And there's so much more we could have said. Of course, that is the nature of the beast. But the year is coming to a close. Our time is running short.
You know, it's the solstice today, the day we're recording, right? The shortest day of the year.
I suppose it is. You're right.
And we should really be reading John Donne's poem on St. Lucy, right? The shortest day. But alas.
I mean, let's admit that the dream is to always be reading every text at once. But
that is
we
the
simply
dream.
cannot.
That is the dream.
But do you have any thoughts about the last year of reading? I mean, we've recorded a lot of our specific travels in the podcast.
And well, we moved also to this very different format. I was kind of just reflecting on this earlier today. I think when we were doing, we would choose 3 really carefully curated works that we would juxtapose around a kind of a theme. It was much more structured. And I feel that was really interesting. And we generated all kinds of interesting conversations there. And now we're doing so, it's like, I don't want to say more spontaneous exactly, but it's more reflecting the reality of reading that's squeezed in to your regular life in between all the other things you have to do. And I don't know if it's as interesting for our listeners, but it's been, I think, really interesting for us exploring with this like more flexible format, this more kind of supple format. And I don't know if we'll keep doing this or we'll do something different, but I feel like it's been a really great feature of this year.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I've heard nice things from the listeners, but listeners do write in and let us know what you think. But I have had a lovely time using the structure that we've got now as a way of encouraging me to read different texts for different reasons and really dig into related texts in a way that we didn't often get to do in the previous format. And I've really loved that. I'm sure listeners have noticed by now that I like to talk about a main text and then talk about 1 or 2 other related texts and sort of sneak them in, especially if they are less famous than the main text. And that's been a great thing to do. I love trying to organize that little thing. I love it when you come up with a text first and I'm like, ooh, let me think if there's something that might pair with that. Or I just want to read whatever I want to read. And the fact that you're doing a famous text might allow me to talk about something much weirder. I don't know. That's also good. Yeah, I'm enjoying the flexibility of this format and I hope people are enjoying it as well. I also will say that I had set out in the beginning of the year, I think I mentioned this in our January episode, that I wanted to read more of the books that friends had written that were in my to read pile. And I did not read as many of them as I wanted to, but I absolutely made a dent.
You read some.
And it's been delightful to read them. I'm glad that I finally got a chance. I had started reading Dayspring back when it first came out, and then something happened, and I got very distracted, and then I put it down, and then you know how that goes. And I was been waiting for a while now to give myself an excuse to get back to it and actually finish it, and I'm glad I finally did. And I have more books by friends to work my way through. I guess next year. I guess I'm going to keep working at that pile.
Me too. I have 2 books by friends here that I am partly through one of them, and the other one I'm just starting. One of them is Catherine Conabere's Augustine the African, which is really good.
Ooh.
And the other one is, I think, a book you may be reading too, David Townsend's Ram in the Thicket.
I haven't picked it up yet, but it's definitely on my to read pile list.
Yeah.
And Ram in the Thicket is a retelling of Julian of Norwich. Is that right?
That's right. An imagined encounter with Marjorie Kemp. and her life more broadly.
I actually haven't read Julian of Norwich or Marjorie Kemp
We should do that.
in full. I've read little bits of them, but I haven't read them in full.
Oh, we should do that
We should
together.
do all the books all the time.
No. I mean, if you read the Rambler thing, I'll read it too, and then I'll reread Julian and or Marjorie, and you could look at whichever one of those you want to.
All right. Well, maybe that'll happen sometime next year. We will see. I have to say, one of my big dreams for the next year is that I want to read a ludicrously enormous book. I haven't decided which one yet, but Proust or Tales of Genji or something that is just like, oh my word, that is something I'm going to have to plan for months of my life around.
Yeah.
We'll see if that actually happens, but it would be kind of fun.
Yeah, actually, I've dipped in. I've only read a tiny bit of Tale of the Genji. I've read little, slightly longer sections of Proust. I'd be happy to go back to that too. I mean, we don't have to read the same thing, but it's always fun when we have that chance.
Yeah, I've definitely read a good chunk of the first book of Proust, but I have certainly not made my way through all of it. I don't know, and I haven't. And Genji has just been, a life goal, and there are plenty of other books like that as well.
And it's almost time for the annual rereading of Moby Dick, I have to say. So there's that.
There you go. Well, we have an entire year, I guess, of things to look forward to and to plot around. But listeners, we hope you've had a good year of listening and reading. And thank you again, as always, for joining us. And for those listeners who are kind enough to support us on Patreon, we have a special treat coming your way as I and a few of the other Megaphonic hosts have gathered for our annual episode of The Greatest Podcast Ever Recorded, where we talk about some half-forgotten movie from the past. This time, we looked at 1970s musical biopic Song of Norway about the life of Edvard Grieg.
That sounds amazing.
It's forgettable, but it's real fun to talk about. It's got Florence Henderson, the mom from the Brady Bunch, and one of the people on the podcast, friend of the show, Michael Collins, my husband, is a huge fan of Grieg. So we get a lot of his informed and impassioned feedback on it. And I believe he is playing a little bit of Grieg for the recording. So anybody who's thrown us a little bit of money will be able to listen to that and have a good time hearing about a movie that they should not watch. They do not need to watch that movie. But other than that, listeners, if you would like to get in touch with us, you can always email us at spouter@megaphonic.fm. We would love to hear from you. This show is made possible by people like you supporting us on Patreon. You can find out more at patreon.com/megaphonic. Show notes with links for anything we've mentioned in this episode are at megaphonic.fm/spouter/88. And the Spouter-Inn is one of the fancy little podcasts over at Megaphonic FM. So, until next time,
see you again at the Spouter-Inn.